The morning of September 4th, 1944, began like so many others over the Philippine Sea with violence painted across an empty sky. Lieutenant Jiro Tanaka's A6M0 carved through the humid air at 12,000 feet, his formation scattered after yet another brutal engagement with American carrier aircraft. Below him, the ocean stretched endlessly, its surface broken only by the occasional whitecap and the dark stain of fuel oil marking where something had gone down. Then he saw it. A blue-grey shape trailing smoke, descending in a controlled spiral toward a small coral atoll barely visible on the horizon. Tanaka's instincts flared immediately. This wasn't the wild tumbling of a doomed aircraft. This was a pilot fighting for survival, nursing his crippled machine toward anything that resembled land. He banked hard, signaling his wingman to follow, and dove after the wounded American fighter. As they closed the distance, Tanaka got his first clear look at the aircraft. It was one of the new ones, a Grumman F6F Hellcat. Broader and heavier than anything the Americans had fielded before, with a blunt nose that housed an enormous engine and wings thick enough to mount 6 machine guns. His squadron had encountered them twice in recent weeks, and both times the results had been devastating. The Hellcats didn't dogfight like the old Wildcats. They didn't need to. They simply powered through Japanese formations, their guns tearing Zeros apart with methodical efficiency before climbing away faster than any pursuit could follow. This one had taken damage, though. Tanaka could see the bullet holes stitching across the fuselage, the glycol streaming from somewhere near the engine cowling, and the pilot's canopy partially shattered. Yet somehow, impossibly, the aircraft was still flying. A Zero with that much battle damage would have disintegrated or erupted in flames long before reaching this point. The Americans had built something fundamentally different, and Tanaka felt a cold, knot of understanding forming in his chest. The Hellcat pilot ejected 100 feet above the coral beach, his parachute blossoming white against the blue sky. The fighter itself pancaked into the sand with a grinding screech of metal, its propeller disintegrating in a spray of broken blades. But it didn't burn, it didn't explode, it simply stopped. Tanaka circled once, twice, watching the pilot scramble away from his aircraft and disappear into the jungle. Then he looked at the Hellcat again, sitting there mostly intact on the beach, and made a decision that would change everything. "Don't strafe it," he ordered over the radio. His wingman, who had already begun lining up for an attack run, hesitated. "Sir?" The question crackled with confusion. Standard procedure was to destroy any downed enemy equipment. "I said don't," Tanaka repeated, his mind racing through possibilities. "Report its position, exact coordinates. Tell them we need a recovery team immediately." Within 6 hours, a small boat approached the atoll under cover of darkness. The recovery crew worked with desperate speed, knowing that American search and rescue operations would be combing this area by morning. They rigged cables around the Hellcat's airframe, drained what fuel remained, and began the painstaking process of disassembly. The engine alone required 8 men to lift. It was a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial monster that weighed nearly a ton, and produced power that seemed almost obscene to engineers accustomed to the Zero's lighter Nakajima Sakai engine. When they finally got it detached and lowered onto the boat, one of the mechanics simply stared at it in disbelief. "This is what they're putting in fighter aircraft?" he whispered. "This belongs in a bomber. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." By dawn, the Hellcat had been reduced to components packed in crates marked with deliberately vague labels. The journey to Japan took 3 weeks, moving through Manila and then by heavily guarded freighter to Yokosuka Naval Air Arsenal. Every delay felt like torture to the intelligence officers who knew what they had. American air superiority wasn't just about numbers or tactics anymore. It was about machines that operated on an entirely different philosophy of design, and Japan desperately needed to understand what they were facing. When the crates finally arrived at Yokosuka in late September, the arsenal's chief engineer, Commander Hideaki Yamamoto, supervised the unpacking personally. What emerged was like nothing his team had studied before. The Hellcat's aluminum skin was nearly twice as thick as a Zero's. The wing spars were massively reinforced, built to absorb punishment rather than minimize weight. Self-sealing fuel tanks lined the fuselage, a technology Japan had discussed, but never successfully implemented at scale. And everywhere, armor plate, behind the pilot's seat, around the engine, protecting the oil cooler. This wasn't an aircraft designed to dance through the sky. It was designed to survive. Its American philosophy made manifest, Yamamoto said quietly, running his hand along the wing's leading edge. They know their pilots will be hit. They know they'll take damage. So they build machines that can absorb it and keep fighting. One of his junior engineers frowned. But sir, the weight penalty must be enormous. How can it possibly compete with our Zero's maneuverability? Yamamoto looked at the massive engine sitting separately on its transport cradle. The R2800 gleamed dully under the hangar lights, its 18 cylinders arrayed in 2 perfect rows, its supercharger assembly complex enough to require its own manual. Because, he said slowly, they don't compete with our maneuverability. They make it irrelevant. The reassembly took 6 weeks. Japanese mechanics worked with meticulous care, photographing every joint, every wire, every hydraulic line. American engineering was different, less elegant perhaps, but brutally functional. Everything was standardized, everything was accessible, everything was built to be maintained by average technicians rather than artisan craftsmen. It was the engineering equivalent of mass production warfare, and it terrified the men who understood its implications. By late October, the Hellcat was whole again. They'd painted over most of its American markings, but left enough to remind everyone what they were dealing with. The aircraft sat in the center of the Yokosuka testing hangar, surrounded by measurement equipment, cameras, and a crowd of pilots and engineers who regarded it with a mixture of professional fascination and growing dread. This wasn't just an enemy fighter anymore. It was evidence of an industrial gap that might be impossible to close. Lieutenant Commander Katsuhiko Kawanishi drew the assignment to fly it. At 32, he was one of Japan's most experienced test pilots, a veteran of nearly 200 combat missions who had survived encounters with everything the Americans and British had thrown at the Pacific Fleet. He'd flown captured aircraft before a battered Wildcat in 1942, a P-40 Warhawk that had force-landed in Burma. But approaching the Hellcat felt different. This machine radiated purpose in a way those earlier aircraft hadn't. Kawanishi climbed into the cockpit slowly, studying the unfamiliar layout. Everything was larger, heavier, more robust than Japanese designs. The control stick was thicker, the throttle quadrant more substantial. Even the instrument panel, though logically arranged, was built with components that seemed over-engineered for their purpose. Redundancy upon redundancy. American pilots, he realized, were wrapped in layers of protection that went far beyond armor plate. He found the fuel mixture controls, set them to full, rich, and reached for the ignition. The moment he engaged the starter, everything changed. The R2800 didn't purr to life like a Zero's engine. It roared. A deep, thunderous bellow that shook the entire airframe and sent vibrations through the concrete floor of the hangar. 18 cylinders firing in perfect sequence, each one adding its voice to a mechanical symphony of raw power. Outside, engineers stumbled backward from the blast of prop wash. The noise was almost painful. Kawanishi let the engine warm up, watching the oil temperature and cylinder head gauges climb into their operating ranges. The Americans had even included a manifold pressure gauge that could handle readings up to 60 inches of mercury pressures that would destroy a Japanese engine in seconds. This machine was built to be pushed hard, built to operate at limits that would be considered abusive in any Japanese aircraft. When all the temperatures stabilized, he released the brakes and added power. The Hellcat lurched forward like a living thing suddenly freed. The tail came up almost immediately, and Kawanishi found himself racing down the runway faster than he'd expected. At 80 knots, barely past rotation speed for a zero, he pulled back gently on the stick. The Hellcat leaped into the air. There was no other word for it. The aircraft simply commanded the sky, its massive engine hauling it upward with an authority that made every previous flight of Kawanishi's career feel tentative by comparison. He climbed straight ahead, watching the altimeter needle wind rapidly clockwise. 1,000 feet, 2,000, 3,000. The rate of climb was staggering, over 3,000 feet per minute with just moderate throttle. A zero at full power couldn't match this. He leveled off at 5,000 feet and began his first turns, expecting the sluggishness that should accompany such a heavy airframe. Instead, he found an aircraft that responded with smooth precision. Yes, it was heavier than a zero. Yes, it couldn't quite match a zero's turn radius. But it didn't fall out of the sky when turned aggressively. It didn't lose all its energy in a single hard bank. The Hellcat fought physics with pure power, using that enormous engine to maintain speed through maneuvers that should have bled velocity away. Kawanishi pushed the throttle forward to military power and pulled into a steep climb. The engine note deepened as the supercharger spooled up, forcing compressed air into those 18 hungry cylinders. The horizon dropped away, 8,000 feet, 10,000, 12,000. The Hellcat climbed without complaint, without overheating, without the engine roughness that plagued Japanese fighters at altitude. At 15,000 feet, where Japanese engines gasped for air and pilots bundled against the cold, the R-2800 still pulled strong. He leveled off and keyed the radio. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but carried clearly through the static. The power it's beyond anything we have. This isn't just a better engine, it's an entirely different class of machine. Below, in the control tower, engineers exchanged glances. They'd measured the specifications on paper. They knew the Hellcat's published performance figures, but hearing it confirmed by one of their best pilots, hearing the awe in his voice, made it real in a way numbers never could. Kawanishi spent another 30 minutes testing the aircraft, exploring its flight envelope with the careful precision of a pilot who knew his life depended on understanding exactly what this machine could and couldn't do. He dove it, climbed it, rolled it, and pushed it through every basic aerobatic maneuver. And with every test, the same conclusion reinforced itself. This was an aircraft built by an industrial power operating at a scale Japan could no longer match. When he finally brought the Hellcat in for landing, his hands were shaking slightly on the controls, not from fear or exertion, but from the weight of understanding. He'd spent years believing that Japanese pilots' superior skill and their Zero's legendary maneuverability would always provide an edge. One flight in this captured American fighter had shattered that belief completely. As the wheels touched down and he throttled back, letting the big fighter roll to a stop, Kawanishi already knew what his report would say, and he knew that most people who read it wouldn't want to believe him. November 1st, 1944. The pre-dawn darkness over Yokosuka Naval Air Arsenal carried an unusual tension. In the operations bunker, pilots and engineers gathered around cups of weak tea, their conversations muted and careful. Today's test flight would be different from the standard performance evaluations. Today, the captured Hellcat would face Japanese fighters in mock combat, a direct comparison between America's new standard carrier fighter and the aircraft that had once dominated the Pacific skies. Lieutenant Commander Kawanishi arrived, early, walking the pre-flight inspection of the Hellcat with methodical precision. 3 weeks of test flights had made him intimately familiar with the aircraft, but familiarity bred respect rather than contempt. Every time he flew this machine, he discovered some new detail that spoke to the thoroughness of American engineering. This morning he noticed the mechanics had somehow procured authentic American 50 caliber ammunition inert rounds for weight and balance, but real enough to load into the 6 wing-mounted Browning machine guns. The Hellcat would fly at combat weight, every advantage and disadvantage fully represented. Across the tarmac, two Mitsubishi A6M50s were being prepared for flight. These weren't training aircraft or war-weary veterans. They were fresh from the factory, representing the latest refinements to Jiro Horikoshi's legendary design. Slightly more powerful engines, reinforced wing spars, improved ailerons for better roll rate. These were the best Zeros Japan could currently produce, and they would be flown by two of Yokosuka's most skilled pilots. Lieutenant Jiro Tanaka, the same pilot who had first spotted the downed Hellcat over the Philippine Sea, and Lieutenant Saburo Nakamura, a combat veteran with 17 confirmed kills. As the first grey light touched the eastern horizon, the three aircraft were towed to their starting positions. The Zeros gleamed silver in the growing dawn, elegant and purposeful. The Hellcat, by contrast, looked brutish and utilitarian in its blue-grey paint. But appearances, as everyone present was about to learn, could be desperately misleading. Commander Yamamoto briefed the pilots one final time in the operations room. "This is not about national pride," he said firmly, looking at each man in turn. "This is about gathering data that might save Japanese pilots' lives. Fly your aircraft to their limits. Document everything. And remember, mock combat means no actual contact, but fight as if your lives depend on it." The rules were straightforward. Engagement would begin at 8,000 feet over the test range. Each aircraft would attempt to achieve a position advantage specifically, a clear 6 o'clock position representing a viable gun solution. The engagement would continue until either achieving this position for 10 seconds or until fuel constraints required termination. Radio calls would be recorded for analysis. Gun camera footage would capture every maneuver. At 0630 hours, engines roared to life across the airfield. The Zeros' Nakajima Sakai engines produced their characteristic high-pitched whine, refined and precise. The Hellcat's R2800 answered with its now familiar thunder, a bass note that vibrated through the watching crowd's chest cavities. Three aircraft taxied to the runway in sequence, Kawanishi and the Hellcat first, followed by the two Zeros in a loose formation. The Hellcat rolled first, its tail coming up quickly, then leaping into the air after barely 400 meters of runway. The Zeros followed 20 seconds later, rising with their characteristic grace, like birds rather than machines. To the observers on the ground, it looked like an absurdly uneven match, one heavy American fighter against two of Japan's finest interceptors. The smart money was on the Zeros' agility, overwhelming the Hellcat's raw power. They were about to learn how wrong that assessment was. At 8,000 feet, the three aircraft formed a triangle roughly a kilometer apart. The morning sun had cleared the horizon now, painting the sky in shades of gold and pale blue. Perfect visibility. No weather factors to complicate the test. Just three aircraft, three pilots, and the physics of aerial combat. "Begin," crackled the radio call from the tower. Kawanishi immediately pushed the throttle to military power and pitched the Hellcat's nose up. The R2800 roared, and the fighter climbed like it was riding an invisible elevator. The rate of climb was shocking, over 3,200 feet per minute at this altitude. The Zeros, light and agile, climbed after him but immediately began falling behind. At full power, a Zero could manage perhaps 2,800 feet per minute in optimal conditions. Against the Hellcat's climb rate, they were simply outmatched. "He's going vertical," Tanaka called to Nakamura. "Split and try to catch him on the recovery." Both Zeros banked apart, attempting to position themselves for the moment when Kawanishi would have to level off or stall. Standard tactics against heavier fighters let them blow their energy in a climb, then pounce when they're slow and vulnerable. Except the Hellcat didn't become vulnerable. At 12,000 feet, Kawanishi rolled inverted and pulled through, converting his altitude into speed with practiced efficiency. The Hellcat accelerated in the dive like a stone dropping down a well. The airspeed indicator wound past 300 knots, then 350, then 400. At that speed, The Zero's controls became dangerously stiff, control surfaces approaching their structural limits. The Hellcat, with its reinforced airframe and powerful control systems, simply absorbed the loads and kept accelerating. Kawanishi leveled out at 6,000 feet with tremendous excess speed, then pulled into a climbing turn that brought him up behind and below Nakamura's Zero. The gun camera whirred, recording what would have been a perfect deflection shot. "First kill," Kawanishi called calmly. 0-1 is down. Nakamura broke hard left, his Zero pulling a turn radius that no Hellcat could match. In a sustained turning fight, the Zero's lighter wing, loading and more responsive controls gave it an insurmountable advantage. But Kawanishi didn't try to follow the turn. Instead, he used his excess speed to climb again, gaining another 1,000 feet while the Zero completed its defensive spiral. Now, he had both altitude and energy advantage. Tanaka tried to climb to engage, but his Zero, having burned energy in the earlier maneuvers, couldn't match the Hellcat's sustained climb rate. Kawanishi simply pulled up and away, and there was nothing the Zero pilot could do about it. On the ground, the engineering team watched through binoculars and scribbled furious notes. "He's completely dictating the engagement terms," one analyst said. "The Zeros can't force him to fight their fight." Another engineer, older and more experienced, nodded grimly. "That's exactly the point. American pilots don't dogfight anymore. They energy fight. Climb, dive, hit, extend. The Hellcat is built for that specific tactical doctrine." For 20 minutes, the mock combat continued. Tanaka and Nakamura tried every trick they'd learned in years of combat flying. They attempted coordinated attacks, with one Zero acting as bait while the other positioned for a shot. But Kawanishi simply climbed above both of them, forcing them to separate or risk mid-air collision. They tried defensive weaving, hoping to cause the Hellcat to overshoot, but Kawanishi never let himself get slow enough to be trapped. He would simply extend away, climb to regain advantage, and come back on his terms. The Zeros managed only 2 theoretical gun solutions during the entire engagement, both times catching the Hellcat in vulnerable positions during brief moments when Kawanishi misjudged his energy state. But even then, the tactical situation wasn't clear-cut. On the ground, analysts reviewing the gun camera footage noted that in both cases, the Zeros would have been firing from marginal range, their lightweight 20mm cannons barely able to reach the target. The Hellcat's 6.50 caliber Brownings, by contrast, would have been devastatingly effective from the positions Kawanishi achieved closer range, better deflection angles, more ammunition for longer engagement times. When fuel constraints finally ended the test, all 3 aircraft returned to Yokosuka. The Zeros landed first, touching down with their characteristic delicate precision. The Hellcat followed, its approach faster and more aggressive, but controlled and professional. As the engines shut down and silence returned to the airfield, the gathered observers realized they'd just witnessed something historically significant. The empirical demonstration of exactly why American fighters were systematically destroying Japanese air power across the Pacific. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In the debriefing room, Tanaka spoke first. His face was flushed from exertion and frustration. "We couldn't catch him. Every time we thought we had position, he simply powered away. It's like fighting someone who can choose when and where to engage, and all you can do is react." Nakamura nodded agreement. "The turn radius advantage is meaningless if we can never force a turning fight. He climbs faster, dives faster, and maintains energy better. The only time we could have gotten him was if he made a mistake, and in combat, we'd be dead long before he made enough mistakes." Kawanishi sat quietly, still in his flight suit, letting the Zero pilots speak their piece. When they finished, he looked at Commander Yamamoto. "The aircraft's advantages aren't just performance specifications. They're tactical enablers. The armor means American pilots can take chances we can't afford. The power means they can dictate engagement geometry. The fuel capacity means they can wait us out. And the firepower. He paused, considering his words carefully. In a real engagement, those 6 50 caliber guns would have destroyed both Zeros in the first pass. The weight of fire is overwhelming. The room fell silent. Everyone present understood the implications, but hearing it stated so baldly was still difficult. The Zero, which had terrorized Allied pilots in 1941 and 1942, was now obsolete, not because it had gotten worse, but because American engineering had systematically addressed every weakness that made the Zero effective. Armor defeated the Zero's light guns. Power overcame its agility advantage. Robust construction absorbed damage that would destroy Japanese fighters. It was a comprehensive engineering counter, backed by industrial capacity that could produce Hellcats faster than Japan could train replacement pilots. Commander Yamamoto stood and addressed the group. We will compile a complete report with all performance data, gun camera footage, and pilot testimonies. This information will go directly to Naval High Command and to Mitsubishi's Design Bureau. He looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. What we learned today is that the fundamental assumptions underlying our fighter doctrine are no longer valid. The question now is whether we have the resources and time to develop an effective response. Nobody answered. They all knew the truth. Japan's industrial base was collapsing under Allied bombing, fuel was scarce, and pilot training had been reduced to weeks instead of years. Even if Mitsubishi could design a Hellcat killer tomorrow, there was no realistic way to produce it in meaningful numbers. As the debriefing broke up, Tanaka found Kawanishi near the Hellcat, running his hand along the fighter's armored fuselage. "You flew it perfectly," Tanaka said quietly. "Like you'd been training in it for months." Kawanishi shrugged. "The aircraft makes it easy. That's the terrifying part. It doesn't require exceptional skill. An average American pilot in this machine is deadlier than our best pilots in a Zero. They've industrialized air superiority." The two pilots stood together in silence, looking at the Hellcat. In the distance, the sound of aircraft engines carried across the water, American bombers on another mission, probably hitting targets near Osaka. The war was drawing closer every day. "How many more of these are there?" Tanaka finally asked. Kawanishi had seen the intelligence reports. Thousands. Grumman is producing them at a rate we can barely comprehend. And they're not the only ones. There are also the Corsairs, the Mustangs, the Thunderbolts. Each one is built on the same philosophy. Survive, overpower, outlast. Tanaka nodded slowly, his expression distant. In his mind, he was probably replaying the mock combat, trying to find some tactical approach that might have worked, some way to overcome the raw performance differential. But Kawanishi knew the truth, and soon Tanaka would accept it too. There was no clever tactical solution to an engineering problem. The age of the dogfight, where pilot skill and aircraft agility reigned supreme, was ending. The new age belonged to machines like the Hellcat, powerful, brutal, and backed by an industrial base that could replace losses faster than they accumulated. That evening, as maintenance crews secured the Hellcat in its hangar, Kawanishi walked alone along the airfield perimeter. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in deep reds and purples. Somewhere out there, American carrier groups were steaming closer, their decks packed with Hellcats, and their pilots trained in the energy-fighting tactics that made those aircraft so deadly. Japan's carriers were mostly sunk, her experienced pilots mostly dead, her fuel reserves nearly exhausted. And now, even the technological advantage of the Zero, the one thing that had given Japanese pilots an edge in the war's early years, was gone. The captured Hellcat had revealed the truth that many had suspected but few wanted to accept. The war in the Pacific was effectively over. All that remained was determining how much longer Japan would continue fighting a battle she could no longer win. The morning after the mock combat test, a different kind of examination began at Yokosuka Naval Air Arsenal. While pilots and tacticians debated the implications of what they'd witnessed, the engineering team turned their attention to the heart of the Hellcats in superiority, the massive Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine. Chief Engineer Hideaki Yamamoto had been dreading this part of the analysis. Specifications on paper were one thing, but seeing the physical reality of American engine technology would force uncomfortable confrontations with Japan's industrial limitations. The R2800 sat on a reinforced test stand in the Arsenal's engine laboratory, its 18 cylinders arranged in two perfect rows, each one larger than the entire cylinder of a motorcycle engine. At 2,800 cubic inches of displacement, it was more than double the size of the Nakajima Sakai engine that powered the Zero. But size alone didn't tell the complete story. It was the sophistication of the design, the quality of the manufacturing, and the material science that truly separated American and Japanese engineering. Yamamoto began the disassembly personally, starting with the massive propeller reduction gearbox. The gears themselves were made from alloy steel that had been case-hardened to a degree Japanese manufacturers could barely achieve. Under magnification, the gear teeth showed precision machining that suggested automated production, each tooth identical to the next within tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. "This isn't artisan work," Yamamoto said to his assistant, a young engineer named Takeshi Sato. "This is industrial production at a scale we can't match. They're making these engines by the thousands, and every one is this precise." As they worked deeper into the engine, revelations accumulated like evidence at a crime scene. The crankshaft was a forged masterwork, balanced so perfectly that the entire engine ran smoother than most Japanese engines half its size. The connecting rods were made from aluminum alloy that combined lightweight with extraordinary strength materials that Japanese industry could produce in small quantities for experimental aircraft, but never in volume sufficient for mass production. The pistons showed evidence of advanced metallurgy as well, with compression rings that maintained seal integrity even under the tremendous pressures generated by the engine's supercharger system. And that supercharger, Yamamoto spent an entire day examining it alone. It was a two-stage, two-speed system that could maintain engine power to altitudes where Japanese engines gasped and died. The mechanical complexity was staggering. Variable speed drive systems, automatic boost control, intercoolers to reduce charge temperature, all integrated into a package that somehow remained reliable enough for combat operations. This represents at least 5 years of development, Yamamoto told the assembled engineering team during that evening's briefing. Probably more. The Americans didn't just scale up an existing engine, they fundamentally rethought how to build reliable high-power aircraft engines. But the most disturbing discoveries came when examining the engine's materials and manufacturing processes. The cylinder barrels were made from steel alloy that had been nitrided, a surface hardening process that created wear-resistant cylinder walls capable of withstanding thousands of hours of operation. Japanese cylinder manufacturing used different processes that were cheaper but produced engines with far shorter service lives. American aircraft engines could run for 1,000 hours or more between overhauls. Japanese engines often required major maintenance after 200 to 300 hours. The fuel injection system told a similar story, where Japanese engines used relatively simple carburetors that could flood or starve during violent maneuvers. The R2800 employed a sophisticated injection system that maintained perfect fuel metering regardless of aircraft attitude. This meant American pilots could execute negative G maneuvers without engine hesitation, a critical advantage in combat that Japanese pilots couldn't match. Yamamoto had heard combat reports of American fighters doing splits maneuvers or inverted flight that would cause Japanese engines to cut out. Now he understood the mechanical reason why. Over the following weeks, the engineering team compiled a comprehensive technical report that ran to over 200 pages of analysis, diagrams, and metallurgical studies. but the core message could be summarized in a single damning paragraph that Yamamoto wrote in the executive summary. The R2800 double Wasp represents an industrial and technological capability that currently exceeds Japanese manufacturing capacity by a significant margin. The engine's design embodies American advantages in materials science, precision manufacturing, and systems integration. Attempting to directly copy this design would be impossible with current Japanese industrial infrastructure. Developing an equivalent indigenous engine would require resources and time that are not available within realistic wartime constraints. The report landed on desks in Tokyo, like a bomb. Naval Ministry officials who still believed in Japanese technological superiority found themselves confronting engineering facts that couldn't be dismissed or rationalized. The Hellcat wasn't just a better fighter aircraft. It was evidence of an industrial base operating at a fundamentally different level. While Japanese factories struggled to produce enough basic fighters to replace combat losses, American factories were churning out technological masterpieces by the thousands. Lieutenant Commander Kawanishi was called to Tokyo in late November to brief senior naval officers on both the flight characteristics and the engineering analysis. The meeting took place in a converted office building that had survived the increasingly frequent B-29 raids. Blackout curtains covered the windows. The air smelled of stale cigarette smoke and anxiety. "Give us your assessment," Admiral Kurita said without preamble. "Can we develop a counter?" Kawanishi chose his words carefully. These men had the power to send him back to combat duty, and honesty about Japan's deteriorating situation wasn't always welcomed. But he'd also sworn an oath to serve Japan, and that meant telling the truth even when it hurt. The Hellcat's advantages derive from integrated systems design backed by superior industrial capability. He began, "The engine produces 2,000 horsepower reliably. Our best engines struggle to reach 1,200 horsepower, and they do so with reduced reliability. The Hellcat carries armor protection that would make a Zero unflyable due to weight. Their industry can afford the weight penalty. Ours cannot." He pulled out photographs from the test flight's gun camera footage showing the Hellcat's positioning advantages, performance charts comparing climb rates and speed, damage assessment photos showing the armor plate thickness. To counter this aircraft directly would require developing new engines with at least 1,800 horsepower, new manufacturing techniques to produce armor and self-sealing tanks at scale, and new tactical training for pilots. Even if we began today, such a program would take at least 2 years to reach operational deployment. The silence in the room was heavy. Everyone present understood what Kawanishi wasn't saying directly. Japan didn't have 2 years. The B-29 seconds were already hitting the home islands regularly. The Navy's carrier fleet was effectively destroyed. Fuel stocks were dwindling. The war would be decided long before any Japanese Hellcat equivalent could reach frontline squadrons. "What about tactical adaptations?" another officer asked. "Can we train pilots to exploit any weaknesses?" Kawanishi shook his head. "The Hellcat has one weakness: it cannot sustain a tight radius turn with a Zero. But exploiting that weakness requires forcing a turning fight, and the Hellcat's energy advantages mean it can simply refuse to engage on those terms. American pilots are trained to use boom and zoom tactics, attack from altitude, use speed to escape, then climb back to attack again. Against such tactics, the Zero's agility becomes irrelevant." "Then what do you recommend?" Admiral Kurita's voice was tired, the voice of a man who already knew the answer but needed to hear it spoken aloud. Kawanishi met his gaze steadily. "We must accept that air superiority in the Pacific theater has shifted permanently to the Americans. Our focus should shift to developing defensive tactics that maximize survival rates for the pilots we have left, rather than pursuing offensive operations we cannot sustain. Train pilots for single-pass attacks against bomber formations, then immediate withdrawal. Avoid fighter engagements when possible. Preserve pilot experience for homeland defense." It was a defensive doctrine, an admission of defeat in the air war. But it was also realistic, and everyone in that room knew it. The Hellcat and aircraft like it had fundamentally changed the mathematics of aerial combat. Japan's advantages in 1941's superior pilot training, better fighter agility, the element of surprise had all been systematically neutralized by American engineering and industrial production. What remained was a grinding war of attrition that Japan could not win. As the meeting concluded and officers filed out, Admiral Kurita asked Kawanishi to remain. When they were alone, the Admiral's formal mask slipped slightly. "That engine," he said quietly, "the R-2800, could we have built something like it?" Kawanishi considered the question honestly. If we'd started in 1935, had access to American metallurgy, American machine tools, American fuel quality, and American production techniques, perhaps. But we didn't have those resources then, and we don't have them now. The Americans built their aircraft industry over decades. We're trying to catch up in the middle of a war. Kurita nodded slowly. "I saw the Zero fly for the first time in 1940. I thought it was a miracle, an aircraft that could outfight anything the Americans or British had. I thought we'd won the Pacific before the war even started." "We all thought that, sir," Kawanishi said softly. "But the Americans learned. They learned from every defeat, studied every captured Zero, and built machines specifically designed to counter our advantages. The Hellcat isn't an accident. It's a deliberate engineering response to the Zero, backed by an industrial base we can't match." The Admiral walked to the window, looking out at Tokyo through a gap in the blackout curtains. Smoke rose from somewhere to the east, another fire from the previous night's raid. "Sometimes I wonder if we were doomed from the moment we attacked Pearl Harbor," he said. "Not because of tactics or strategy, but because of industrial arithmetic. They can build 10 Hellcats for every Zero we produce. Even if our pilots were twice as skilled, the mathematics eventually overwhelm us." Kawanishi had no answer to that. The mathematics were indeed overwhelming. Grumman alone was producing over 500 Hellcats per month by late 1944. Mitsubishi's best month saw perhaps 300 Zeros produced across all factories. And the gap was widening as American production accelerated while Japanese industry crumbled under bombing and resource shortages. Back at Yokosuka, the captured Hellcat continued to fly test missions through December. Kawanishi flew it as often as fuel allocations allowed, documenting every aspect of its performance envelope. Other pilots rotated through as well, each one coming away with the same grim understanding. This wasn't just a superior aircraft, it was a symbol of everything Japan had underestimated about American industrial power. In January 1945, orders came to cease all test flights. Fuel had become too scarce to waste on a captured enemy aircraft, even one that provided valuable intelligence. The Hellcat was pushed to the back of a hangar, covered with tarps, and forgotten as the war ground toward its decisive, inevitable conclusion. Kawanishi returned to operational duty, assigned to train new pilots in the defensive tactics he'd recommended. The students were painfully young 17, 18 years old, with perhaps 30 hours of total flight time. They would climb into Zeros or Key 43 Oscars and face American pilots with hundreds of hours of experience flying Hellcats, Corsairs, and Mustangs. It was murder dressed up as military necessity. On August 15th, 1945, when the Emperor's radio broadcast announced Japan's surrender, Kawanishi was at a forward airfield preparing for what would have been yet another futile interception mission. The young pilots around him wept or stood in shocked silence. He felt only a terrible sense of relief. The killing would finally stop. That evening, walking alone around the empty airfield, he thought about the Hellcat sitting in storage at Yokosuka. That one aircraft, captured by chance on a remote coral atoll, had revealed the truth that Japan's leadership had refused to accept the war had been unwinnable from the start. Not because Japanese pilots lacked courage or skill, but because American industry could produce technological marvels faster than Japan could count them. The R-2800 engine, with its 2,000 horsepower and sophisticated engineering, was just one example. but it was emblematic of a larger reality. America had weaponized its industrial capacity in a way no nation could match. Japan had started a war with a country that could outproduce, out-engineer, and outlast them in every category that mattered. Years later, after the occupation ended and Japan began its reconstruction, former engineer Yamamoto would write a memoir about his wartime experiences. The chapter about the Hellcat was titled simply, "The Engine That Taught Us Humility." In it, he wrote, "We Japanese are a proud people, and our pride served us well in many endeavors. But in war, pride without realistic assessment of industrial capacity is simply another form of suicide." The R2800 double Wasp engine didn't just power the Hellcat, it powered our understanding that the Pacific War was lost before it began. The captured Hellcat itself survived the war and was eventually returned to American authorities during the occupation. Its ultimate fate is unknown, likely scrapped for metal as surplus military equipment, but the lessons it taught remained. In post-war Japan, as the nation rebuilt its industrial base, engineers studied American manufacturing techniques with intense focus. The precision machining, the quality control systems, the materials science, all the elements that had made the R2800 possible became goals for Japanese industry to achieve. In a strange way, that captured fighter became a teacher more valuable in peace than it ever could have been in war. The men who studied it, who flew it, who understood what it represented, used that knowledge to help build modern Japan's industrial prowess. Kawanishi never flew the fighters again after the war. He became a civilian test pilot for a brief period, then transitioned into engineering consultation. In 1983, shortly before his death, he gave an interview to a military history journal. The interviewer asked if he remembered the Hellcat. "Remember it?" Kawanishi smiled, though his eyes were distant. "I dream about it sometimes. That deep roar of the R2800, the way it climbed like physics was optional, the solidity of the controls. It was the most capable aircraft I ever flew, and it belonged to the enemy. That irony never left me." "Do you think things could have been different?" the interviewer pressed. "If Japan had developed a similar aircraft earlier?" Kawanishi shook his head. The Hellcat wasn't just an aircraft. It was the physical manifestation of American industrial philosophy. Build it strong, build it powerful, build it in overwhelming numbers. Japan couldn't match that philosophy because our entire industrial structure was organized differently. We built beautiful, efficient machines like the Zero. They built brutal, effective machines like the Hellcat. In a war of attrition, brutal effectiveness wins every time. The interview ended there. Kawanishi died 3 months later, at the age of 71. Among his personal effects, his family found a small piece of metal, a fragment of aluminum with rivets still attached. There was no note explaining its significance, but his son recognized it from the interview. A piece of the captured Hellcat's fuselage, kept for 40 years as a reminder of the day a Japanese test pilot learned that his country's war was already lost. Written in the engineering specifications of an enemy fighter's 2,000 horsepower heart,